When we finally got back outside, John had wandered off. Explain what? You just straight up murdered someone, he continued. Finally it let me go, but it had grabbed James 3 around his neck, choking away the little life that he had left. Despite its dangerous content, it would be our safest way to the other side. She was left behind, one of the first people to forget themselves, to hollow out and become one of the empty people. Most people could feel it coming on, they knew that they were about to turn but not her, for whatever reason it happened within seconds. 2 broken legs, a few ribs, and multiple vertebrae. As food supplies grew short and we lost contact with the outside world, people got serious about hiding their most valuable belongings. It had been flayed from top to bottom, not an inch of skin remaining on its bloody surface. I felt him tug on the rope behind me. Not to mention that Greenville is an extremely generic town's name. The monotonous flow of water against the harsh trickle of Storm 3 was somehow soothing. You've been here before, I asked. One time. Towards what? Certain death to be flayed by the Guardians like the pile of corpses back at the river. I don't know, I shouted back, loud enough to attract the attention of corpses back at the river. What makes you so sure that we'll survive then? He asked, looking at me with a mix of fear and confusion. Because now we know it's possible. It's the flesh. They were crystal clear and blue like the color of your eyes. I love you. On the other side of the wall, we were faced with a new type of nightmare. The entire land had turned into an impossible fleshscape, with what appeared as muscles, tendons and blood vessels covering every inch of its surface. It had stopped bleeding, but it was a nasty cut and risk of getting infected. Sometimes we even wanted to get wet. We dove into the water, but they weren't dark and grimy. We made it, James 3, I said on the brink of passing out. It was coming from underground. We had to tread back onto land to get around the lake. How far away is it? Peter asked. I tried to the best of my ability to judge the distance, but the shine of the light made it hard to get a clear view. I don't know, I shouted back, loud enough to attract the attention of the passing empty people, most stuck in debris by then. We had to keep a certain distance away from the river, lest we get dragged away with everything else. The Storm 3 itself wasn't as rough as the rest of the trip, but I was beginning to realize that I might not make it that far. James 3, hold up. I held him tight and I let him cry it out, and he eventually stopped resisting my grip. Thousands of cars immediately congested on the highway. Dad, what are you doing? James 3 asked. Great Peter, my name's John. There's no food, no water, nothing left in this city for us. James 3 presented us with a few water bottles that he had found while searching the neighboring houses. It wasn't much to keep us going, but I had found a new source of motivation. The creature wandered across the meat-covered land, turning its charred torso around while searching for whatever had awoken it, looking for us. After a horrific ordeal, I could finally rest. I sighed before I continued. I climbed down onto the flesh-covered surface. I'm guessing another day and a half's walk, I finally said. They both seemed hopeful. He said as he looked around the room. James 3 pulled out a soaking wet piece of cloth hardly protected from the weather by the bag, but it was all that we had. I wrapped the man in as well as I could and lifted him up on my shoulder. Dad, what if he's like the others? James 3 asked nervously. He can't be, he looks too healthy. Help me carry my things while I carry him. We have to get back to the shelter, fast. Yeah, blazing burning sun. John is gone. He left behind his journal, which is what you've all just read, and while there's a lot more to my and James 3's story, I felt that this should be what I post first. John deserved that much. I'm tired, he said. Another one we passed had just impaled itself on a piece of debris, bleeding profusely. After the last tendril had disappeared, the Guardian closed its eye and simply started sinking back into the ground, leaving the surface monotonous and empty once more. Are we in an abandoned house or something? Whoa Peter, it's not abandoned anymore. Dad, help me. The light was still a few hours away, but it had grown to a tremendous size. A brilliant blue globe lighting our path to salvation. All the pain and fear that had filled my body started to vanish. You're saying the storm started 7 years ago in 2020, making the current year 2027? By my estimation, yeah. What's happening? He asked back. We ain't got time to talk. Who's James 3? The doctor asked as he checked my vitals. A tendril reached for me and I slashed it off with ease. We can't help them. It was slow for sure, and as long as we kept wandering, we would seemingly be safe. That's the first time I noticed how the ground twitched and contracted in response to our steps. We were crushed in the middle of a panicking crowd when my wife Loretta suddenly let go. What happened? He asked weakly. Let him be, I demanded. I walked up behind the woman. My mind wandered. I tried to keep it focused but to no avail. James 3 had started slowing down. As skinny as he was, on the brink of starvation, he simply couldn't keep retaining much heat. Nobody knows about Greenville. No, he kept screaming as I pulled him back inside the warehouse and shut the door. The rest would be spent crossing it. James 3 returned just in time, holding a few cans of beans and a couple of water bottles. Without my help, but unbeknownst to him, he could be our ticket out of here. Tendrils entangled in vessels reached out from the ground and grabbed on to the empty, pulling them down to the ground, slowly consuming and merging them with itself. How are we going to get through here? I asked. I'm sorry, I whispered as blood poured down her newly created orifice. I'll be okay. James 3, being the lightest, walked at the back of our small group while I led the charge. It only took a couple of 100 feet before we saw one of the empty people trapped in a crushed car, emaciated and pale, proudly stuck there for the past year, waiting for someone to pass. We were trapped, scared, and running out of supplies faster than we had anticipated. The blue light hung a few feet in the air on the other side of the lake, appearing as a massive globe of ice. Peter looked at them in disbelief and disgust, unable to believe the horrors that lay before him. It was horribly bright, almost blinding, yet nothing could compare to the beauty. I got a bit further before collapsing to the ground. When we got close enough to see the wall, I could make out figures. So, you've been stuck here for the past 7 years, he asked. James 3, stay away from John. I yelled as I ran over to grab him. Let me go, he said as he tried to wriggle himself loose from my grab. So, we're leaving the city? Peter asked. My muscles burned and my joints ached, but I kept moving, dragging my beaten body across the ground. No, he isn't. It's okay, James 3 said, half asleep. We would find men, women, and children just wandering through the streets at night, wearing nothing more than their nightgowns to protect them from the pouring storm. 3. They had this look in their eyes, as if they weren't aware enough to care about their surroundings. We searched for an hour before finding a partially collapsed warehouse. Not a great cover for the oncoming blizzard, but it was the best that we could do in the outskirts of town. He had lowered his guard by then, either from believing my story or because he simply didn't have much of a choice. Peter was trapped alongside us in the storm, unable to survive without my help, but unbeknownst to him, he could be our ticket out of here. I don't know, I rushed over to console James 3, but he pushed me away. I lost myself for a moment. I can't explain it. We didn't have time to discuss it. Darkness loomed over us as nightfall approached. After catching our breaths once more, we rushed the last few 100 feet across. We desperately needed to find shelter before another blizzard set in. He responded quietly. Faint clicking sounds could be heard in the distance, distorted echoes coming from whatever lurked in the storm. 3. The only opening was by the river. Now that the colony was gone and I was too weak to carry him, he would have to manage on his own. His shoulder, mustering as much confidence as I could into the next few words. My storm 3 of thought was disrupted by what seemed like an oathy-shaped tree stump approaching from up the river. James 3 yelled from one of the windows, breaking me away from my storm 3 storm. "Stay back, James 3, I demanded as I rushed outside, Peter getting up and following suit. The storm 3 poured as always, filling up a smaller sinkhole down the end of the street. Most houses had long since collapsed, and those that still stood were slowly being etched away by the acid. A woman stood in the middle of the street with her back facing towards us. She wore nothing more than a light dress, hardly providing protection from the horrific weather. She had been hurt, leaving an exposed wound on her left shoulder, no longer bleeding but oozing with thick yellow pus. "I'm sorry about your dad, James 3. The light hung just a few feet above us, but I couldn't bring myself back on my feet. I reached out my hand, trying to grab the light, and suddenly I felt the ground give in beneath me. I awoke in the early hours the following morning." They both nodded, confused but diligent. "Dad, there's a woman outside." I shrugged his curiosity off. "James 3, get over here," I called as I ran for the corpse. "We need to get to sleep soon, James 3. You noticed the wound on her arm, her clear apathy towards it." We did as we were told, holding up inside of our home, stocking up on food and water as the worst passed. "Dad! Dad! The man is waking up." I awoke to James 3 shaking me. "James 3. The last thing that I heard was a scream of agony coming from James 3. It was a story that I had told 1,000 times in the past few years, one of the times before the storm, a story about a world that James 3 was far too young to remember, but he had seen a minuscule part of it, and I wanted to keep that glimpse alive, if only as a distant dream. "You want to hear about the sun?" I asked. He nodded happily. "All right, come sit with me, let's try to get dry before we pass out for the night." We huddled up under the blanket, almost dry from the fire, and for the 1,000th time, I told him about the past. "You know, the sky is blue. They found me lying in the middle of a football field. Those are the people that tried to leave," I said. "And that's where we're heading." It meant that there had to be a weak spot in the dark territory, one that we could escape through. I frantically tried to grab onto him, but the light was too bright. I yelled to my son as he tried to relieve himself behind a barren tree. "I'm trying," he shouted back. "People have tried and died. If we kept moving, we would be there in an hour." I dug out a rope from our backpack and tied it between myself and James 3. "Watch out," I yelled. James 3 cried, but I stared on, unable to make myself move. "John, what the hell are you doing?" Peter shouted as he ran over to help James 3. "It's going to be dangerous." All were skinned, but some had additional avulsions. Missing arms, legs, even heads that had been violently torn from some of their bodies. "Bring him to the light and cross over to a better world. He might even have the chance to stop this all from happening." For a moment I considered the fact that the world had kept going long after our city's demise. That despite our hardship, there existed a better place where life thrived. "What happened to them?" he asked. "That's right. All I remember is hitting the ground hard, my body breaking as I landed in a different world. I was high on pain medication, so the doctor initially shrugged off my weird questions. I now donned beside him, trying my best to keep him calm. "Because it's dangerous, Peter." "What the hell is that thing?" I whispered. The one person in his life had been taken away for no reason other than bad luck, simply wasted away in a world where humanity had become little more than a faint memory. James 3 sat by the fire reading John's journal. "Dad, what are you doing?" he continued on the verge of tears. "Follow the river and retrace its path back towards where it grabbed Peter. It might have given us a safe way to pass the guardians lurking in the dark territory. Sometimes they would even get hurt, break a leg or rupture an artery, yet they just kept walking aimlessly around, ignoring our pleas to just come back inside. They said the storm would pass in the week." No, that's something else entirely. Despite the cold blue color, it made me feel warm to once again wander through light, to once again see the landscape in front of me. Do you want to talk about it? I asked James 3. Peter collapsed to the ground in disbelief, fearing that he had suffered the same fate. I walked over and put a comforting hand on his shoulder, mustering as much confidence as I could into the next few words. A few tendrils grew from the ground, wrapped in veins, but James 3 slashed at them with his knife, causing blood to spurt out briefly before it fell to the ground. I lay motionless, unable to breathe. The river got wider as we proceeded. What the hell is she doing just standing there? Peter asked. My mind wandered. I tried to keep it focused but to no avail. People couldn't leave, but then again, none had entered it either. Since the fall of our city and collapse of the colony, Peter was the first seemingly healthy human that we had stumbled across. Even with all my force, I couldn't tear it away, and as a last resort, I simply bit it. A metallic taste filled my mouth as blood spurted from the twisted appendage. It was the only place that I could think to hide, and since the flesh didn't grow much into the water, I hoped it couldn't sense us there. James 3. I upped my pace, but the current had gotten stronger, and the end of the river finally met us. What lay before us was a massive lake, covered by a thin layer of what seemed like human skin, stretched so thin that it had become partially transparent. Why do you ask? John, it's only 2019. There will be no urgency even as they lay there bleeding out. After a good half an hour, I managed to get a few sparks to ignite a fire. He continued sobbing incomprehensibly. I mumbled to myself. I couldn't blame him. It hadn't occurred in the early stages of the dark territory, but now it had become impossible to ignore. They'll beg and bargain. The kid I came through the portal with, where is he? Where's James 3? The doctor laughed. I fixed my attention to it as it drifted closer and realized that it wasn't a piece of wood, but a corpse. Ah, God, not again. I paused for a moment. Talking about my wife was a hard task considering how we lost her. James 3 didn't remember, of course, but it stung deep inside my chest, like a cold hand wrapping around my aching heart. Hospital? I asked back, confused. If it lay just by one of the bodies of water making up the river, it would be another day's trek, meaning that we would have to venture through the dark territory. He was enjoying his expired can of beans, our first meal in 2 days. Hardly a feast, but that didn't matter. He looked at me for a brief moment and shook his head. At the moment of writing this, I'm still cooped up at the hospital. I've tried searching for John and James 3 online, but without their last names, it's a futile task. That's the fate of most people living in this city, and whatever they once were, accountants, mechanics, doctors, and whatever they once were, accountants, mechanics, doctors, they ain't anymore. All they do now is walk around, get hurt, and die. Then why kill them? Because they're already gone. Only their bodies stay behind to suffer. The least that we can do is to free them. Besides, they get riled up if disturbed. We must have hung on to the edge of the river for an hour while the creature searched, all the while its eye remained open, unblinking, desperately looking for intruders. After a while, the clicking stopped, and the tendrils sunk back into the ground. Whoever lived there before had to have emptied the place during the second evacuation. Dark territory. Without any better option, I lifted him up and put him on my back. He had been sheltered, save from the nightmare that had been our lives for the past years, meaning that he still didn't have murder in his heart. I only needed to read the first few lines to realize what had happened. No sooner had we set foot on the edge of the bridge before a brilliantly bright light appeared on the horizon. Piles of dead people littered the water, but the wall wasn't as thick around it. We could pass easily through. It then dawned on me that Peter truly came from a better place, one without the daily horrors that we faced. We've got a long trek ahead of us tomorrow. He silently sobbed as he turned the pages. Look at me, John. Even now it's giving us life, but it's not as strong as it used to be. And then the people started acting strange. He didn't respond. I packed what little things that we had into John's bag. Why did you kill her? He asked with a shaky voice. Because she was already dead, the part of her that matters anyway. John hadn't moved, not even acknowledging our presence. A few more bodies had landed on the riverbank where we found Peter the day before. I remembered his screams of agony, letting go of his hand, and it dawned on me that he had stayed behind, left to suffer in the storm 3. They had found me alone. I was confused, but he had suffered a fairly traumatic head injury, so I let his questions slide while I started breakfast. I cooked up some beans and offered them to Peter. Without supplies I couldn't do much for his wound, only observe and hope a fever didn't fester. Do you know where we are? I asked, trying to get an idea of his state of mind. It pleaded and begged for us to help, asking in the most apathetic voice possible, completely rid of any emotion. Don't go to the other side without me. Walking 10 feet apart would ensure that if one of us fell into a pit or sank into the unstable ground, the other two could pull them back up. Following the second failed evacuation, we searched for weeks, hundreds of colonists looking for their lost loved ones, but to no avail. Loretta was more than likely one of the empties that wandered into harm's way. Loretta was more than likely one of the empties that wandered into harm's way, dying from their own neglect. She loved taking us out to the beach, endless oceans and soft sand beneath our feet. As night fell over us, the storm worsened, turning from heavy storm 3 to a murderous blizzard. Do you know where you are? No, I was out walking. My head, it really hurts. As I did, I also lifted up my hunting knife and I cut her throat. Talking while wandering was a painful task. I tried so desperately to grab a hold of her again, but she simply stood there, letting the crowd trample her down as we were pulled away. Listen, Peter, you hit your head pretty hard. Beyond the darkness and thick clouds that we see outside, there's a whole other world without Storm 3, without thunder and lightning. They had miraculously navigated across the bridge without getting impaled or hurt by the various debris. Though if the storm truly begins in 2020, we might not have much time left. John, if you read this, believe me when I say this is going to happen and get out of Greenville. Let me deal with it, I responded. They kept mumbling nonsense as they walked past. The only word I could make out was, salvation. I thought it ironic that we would most likely die from dehydration, all the while soaking wet from the sulfuric storm 3 falling down from above. Even with James 3 on my back, I could outrun them, but not for long. Don't give up, James 3, I begged. Dad. John. Peter chimed in. James 3, I love you. He can't be. I'm from Portland. Portland wasn't anywhere nearby. Dad, he cried. But it's all gone now, isn't it? I'm sure it's out there somewhere, and I promise you as soon as we can find a way past the Guardians, I'll take you there. And then I fell. It only took an hour to walk through the storm, but in my fragile state, carrying someone as heavy as that man put me on the brink of collapse. Any direction in the distance. Beneath the pitch-black skin of the creature, a couple of lids tore apart, revealing a single, completely white eye with a minuscule pupil darting rapidly around in its socket. We lowered ourselves into the water, hoping the creature wouldn't notice us. The veins on her arm were protruding out, marking an infection that was growing up towards her neck. She was on the brink of sepsis and would soon perish. 7 years. At that point, their identities were nothing more than a distant memory, an unimportant detail. Seconds later, she had died. I ordered, we can't help them. I swung with all my force and I cut through it. In a matter of hours, my mind would be lost and my son would be left alone, fending for himself with a someone who clearly didn't belong. And with that, I let myself pass out. Days track just to get to the bridge. As my vision returned, I saw a brilliant blue sky, cloudless, only decorated with our yellow majestic sun. I laughed. Though I couldn't exactly determine its origin, it came from several directions as if something was communicating. I don't know, but the plan stays the same. Those things can sense our touch. Well, all right. But do you have a better plan? There's no food left, no water, nothing. You want to go back? We'll die before we find shelter again. You're not empty. Hand me the blanket. I don't remember anything other than walking around. I was heading for a picnic, I think, and then there was a bright flash and the next thing I know, I wake up here. Peter was coughing and begging for water. Many years ago we lived in the sun with your mother, and we were so happy. Not yet. The waters were murky, the river flowed relentlessly. Calm down, Peter, I can explain. Unlike him, they were beyond saving, flayed and mutilated like all the others. But why didn't it work for James 3? James 3, we're almost there. Yeah, it's been the warmest summer in years, they say. Sometimes they get violent. They'll call out for help. A small group of empty people started getting close. It was rhythmic and split up into intervals. He promised. I set her free. Well, let's say the empty people weren't the only ones losing their sense of self. Without food and or water, this would be our last day whether we found salvation or not. You really don't know what's going on here, do you? I asked. Please, please don't kill me. He continued to panic. Listen to me, Peter. I wish I could be there with you until the end, but my time is up. Hey, don't worry, you're safe. The river stretched all the way towards the light and I knew in my heart that Peter had somehow come through it. I thought it was all a dream. They had become too weak to move, only their blinking eyes proved that they were still alive. Your name is Peter Matthews, correct? I nodded my head, pain radiating down my spine. I asked him again about James 3, mumbling something about the portal and asked if the Storm 3 had come yet. Bruises, torn ligaments, and a punctured lung. We've got a live one. Behind it followed another dozen dead bodies, all floating peacefully on top of the water in various stages of mutilation. The man grunted, starting to wake up. I'm really cold, he said. We tied a rope between the three of us. 7 years, Peter. My son grew up not knowing the warmth of the sun and I'll die before he gets stuck here for the rest of his life. While I frantically yelled in anger, one of the empty people got close enough to grab James 3. I had lost focus and just stared at him in complete apathy for a moment. It didn't matter what happened next. Help me, help me, help me, let's stick together, it begged as it pulled him towards a pit. As it fell over dead, James 3 cried for the first time in years, and Peter turned to me with an angry expression on his face. John, why did you just stand there? He shouted. It doesn't hurt, I promise. You got in, that means we can get out. People had gotten clever during the storm. James 3, hurry up, it's getting dark. You ready to do this, James 3? I asked. They had come from all directions but each were pulled towards the light. On the road, several emaciated figures lay motionless. James 3, do you see that? We're almost home. He didn't respond. You were a good man. If not, we would end up enveloped in the mesh of skin covering the waters. How are you feeling? Oh man, I'm still here. There's no fear, sadness, nor anger in their voices. Despite the Guardians struggling, the tendrils kept growing in number and size, grasping for us as we spurted over the fleshscape. James 3 started coming to it as we got closer to the glowing globe. I was back. But now, we're all getting out of here together. The blue light started enveloping us. What's your name? Peter. Its words making sense, but the emotion behind them non-existent. Hey, take me with you, please, please, please. The way their bodies bobbed up and down in the water reminded me in the most morbid way of times long since past, of the days before the Storm 3, taking James 3 to the beach with his mother, teaching him how to swim. I almost let myself smile despite the horrific sight, but I was quickly jolted back to reality as one of the corpses landed on the riverbank, fully clothed and seemingly unharmed. Greenville? I've never heard that name. Within an hour, it would be dead. Dad, what are you doing? James 3 asked me as I snapped back to reality. I need you to take James 3 with you across the dark territory. Now that I'm unarmed, you're going to listen. Dad! James 3 yelled as he stormed out the door back into the storm 3. James 3 was frantically calling out for his father. I helped him sit up to drink. Well then, how did I get here? He said, getting more agitated by the minute. You deserve so much more than this world has given you, and now you might finally have it. He moaned quietly in agony. My body had grown frail in the past year after these supplies diminished. Both food and water had become a scarce, invaluable resource. I kneeled down beside my son. I just stared. I looked around for James 3. I had held onto his hand, but I couldn't see him anymore. Without waking the other two, I sat down to write the final part of my journal. I've kept track of most of the events during the past 7 years, but I feel like the last 2 days are the most important. I had the thought of killing what remained of him in the back of my head, to free him like he had taught me, but now I wouldn't get that chance. Thanks for saving me, John. This isn't exactly what I had in mind when you said that we had to cross a bridge, Peter said. The river ran straight through the sinkholes, dragging parts of its foundation with it. In any case, we'll need to find shelter. He took the knife, clutching onto it with shaking hands. It put me in harm's way, but I felt safe nonetheless. While we got ready for the day's trek, I felt hopeful. In the blink of an eye, well over 100,000 people had been slaughtered, repurposed for a meat wall spanning around the entire city. In the blink of an eye, well over 100,000 people had been slaughtered, repurposed for a meat wall spanning around the entire city, keeping us trapped. The mere fact that Peter got inside ignited a fresh wave of hope throughout my body. Is that the sun? James 3 asked hopefully. They all seemed the same underneath their skin, and now they just added to the pile of corpses and the hellscape of a city that we called home. He walked towards John, though whatever John had been just a day before, he had been washed away by the heavy storm 3 fall. Before us lay thousands of skinless bodies, entire families embraced in death with horrified expressions on their flayed faces. I noticed a gash on the back of his head covered by his hair. Peter wasn't from around Greenville. Before he could continue, he passed back out. I tried to get him to drink some water, most of which he coughed up. On the brink of starvation, he simply couldn't keep retaining much heat. But while the flesh cape stretched endlessly far, impossible to traverse, the light itself was close within reach. I said calmly while presenting the wounds of somebody who had clearly given up on their own well-being. I mumbled to myself. 7 years since the storm began in 2020. I don't know. He was incredibly strong for a 10-year-old, but I kept him at bay while he cried and punched me. He's gone, James 3. As long as we didn't touch the flash, hopefully it couldn't sense us. It felt warm to the touch, gently bouncing my feet with each stop. Warm summer picnics. Just tell me what the hell you want. This is more like a hole if I'm entirely honest, he continued. Finally, I snapped back to reality, immediately pulling my knife out, pushing the creature away from my son while impaling it through its eye. It's hidden, like an invaluable treasure. Closest town over would have been Clint, but God knows what still existed beyond the boundaries of our hellhole. He turned silent. In a world where nothing ever grew, where food couldn't be made, gold and money had lost their purpose. You did good, James 3. The commotion had attracted a couple of empty people, both relatively unharmed even in the fleshscape. The ground twitched beneath their feet as they approached the creature. The clicking was getting closer, but I was just starting to realize that it didn't come from any direction in the distance. It was coming from underground. The light shined bright in the horizon, reflecting off the millions of Storm 3 drops appearing as endless beams shooting through the air. We kept close to the river. "I'm sorry about earlier," I said to James 3. "It's a guardian. Limbs, viscera, and torn flesh that made out the majority of the wall." We searched the warehouse before I even checked what John had written, but he wasn't inside. I picked up the journal and I opened it. We've never even heard about a storm destroying a city. While we got ready for the day's trek, I felt hopeful. James 3 never came with me through the portal. Any touch would alert the Guardians, and if they saw us, we wouldn't stand a chance. Asking for a hospital, he must have been pretty out of it. Its magnificent contrast to its horrible surroundings. It's because she's one of them, one of the empty people. I kept my knife pointed at him, forcing him to stick around a little bit longer. "Do I look like I'm in my mid-30s?" he asked. Peter shook his head. I got back up on my feet and we kept moving. Wherever the river had taken him from, he definitely didn't belong in the city. I checked his pulse, barely finding a weak one, and though unconscious, he was definitely alive. He didn't respond. "Let's keep moving." It observed them for a brief moment before grabbing one of them with a foot, and in a single swift movement, it tore the empty person in half. Its leg then started expanding and its flesh wrapped around the half that it still held onto. Within a second, the skin had been seared off by acid seeping out through the bursting vesicles on the creature's skin, after which it dumped the flayed person to the ground, letting the flesh fuse together. After less than a minute, both empties had been flayed and consumed, and the creature seemed content, but the original disturbance caused by us still lingered on its mind, and it kept searching while we hid quietly in the river. "You're telling me the world is still going? I'm leaving this to you, Peter, when you find me empty in the morning." They had once been so full of life, surrounded by families enjoying their picnics, now nothing more than a watery grave, destroyed by the ever-present acid storm 3. It was odd, though, that despite the storm it hadn't grown in size, it had remained the same, monotonous body of water, only disturbed by the occasional piece of driftwood floating downstream. Yet I knew leaving would be impossible. He didn't. He looked like somebody in their early 20s, just like I thought when I first found him, yet it made no sense if it truly was that long ago for him, that it meant that he had traveled not only from outside but from the past. "You really think you traveled through time?" I asked, sounding more condescending than intended. "Well, is that less likely than a storm lasting 7 years, people turning empty and mysterious guardians hindering any escape?" he asked back. Despite my disbelief in his statement, he had a point. "Run," I ordered. I grabbed James 3 and headed straight for the river. Another hour and we finally reached the bridge. The evacuation itself was a shit show. Against my advice, he set off to search the house once more. "But that means," I stopped. "You know what happens when there's no system to keep people in place." I'm fine, I'm fine, it said. "Good luck to you both." I was safe. I wanted to enjoy the weather, but by the look of that storm 3 outside, I guess that didn't last very long. "What?" We both stopped walking, but the twitching continued. Going from minor tics to violent spastic contractions, some muscle fibers in the ground opened up beneath our feet, and we pulled away towards the river. I let my mind wander as we slowly walked by the river. He pulled me out of the river, he saved my life, and in return I promised to keep James 3 safe. So whatever happens, do not approach them. I sat looking back and forth between Peter and James 3. James 3 didn't respond. "I mean, this place isn't all that great. It could have been a few feet, it could have been miles." Peter looked with concern at the trapped creatures, worried and sorry about its pitiful fate. If John had been right, we simply needed to follow it all the way to the light. John was standing motionless outside, staring towards the horizon. He didn't even react to James 3's plea for attention. We either take our chances here or we die from thirst and starvation in the city. I had been beaten up quite badly by the fall, but despite it all, I had survived. James 3, we made it, were my first words as I awoke a couple of days later in the hospital. I promise. I lied. So my plan remains, we're following the river, and while we do, we desperately pray to any god that you can think of that we somehow managed to find out how the hell you ended up here. How long have you been here? Was all that he asked. We had to keep walking while we still had the energy. We walked in the knee-deep, freezing water, trying our best to avoid small flesh appendages that had grown into the side of the river. He had become a resourceful kid, but I had little hope that we would find any treasure. They gave me a second chance at life, returned me to my own life. Finally, I managed to get a hold of myself. I'm sorry, I just needed to catch my breath. And paced around the room, 1,000 thoughts and ideas flowing through my mind. I responded, already out of breath. Remember that you made it in here, and I promise you a better chance if we keep going. We followed the river upstream, half a day's track just to get to the bridge. I lit a fire for the night and I shared the last can of beans. John had turned empty and left instructions to me telling me to save James 3. He had almost come to a complete standstill. He nodded as brave as he had ever been. Listen, there's bound to be a bunch of empty people stuck in the debris. Parker kept inquiring about our situation. In the distance, something that looked like a wall appeared, spanning endlessly in each direction around the city. I flipped my knife around, gesturing for Peter to take it. The world had ended, it was only us, only our city, closed off from the rest of the world and left to suffer. That's where the dark territory begins. Save your family while there's still time. The storm 3 pounded hard towards the poisoned earth, ripping away any life that dared settle in the toxic ground. I owe them both my life, and in return, I ended up losing them. For the first time in about 6 years, I truly believed we stood a chance. Dozens of bodies littering the pits among a few surviving stragglers. I took another step, causing a tendril to emerge from the ground and reach for me. It was much thicker than the ones that we had faced before, and I only had one hand free while trying to keep James 3 on my back. You'll see the sun again, James 3. Yeah, that's right. Why do you ask? John, it's only 2019. I chuckled at the absurd statement. We keep moving across the bridge. I saw images of my wife, memories of digging sandcastles on the beach with James 3, flashes of wine and dances, the past of a better life. I was tired, worn down to the bone, hollowed out by the storm 3 like so many people before me. Was I in an accident? Why am I not in the hospital? He asked. We were so close. The light shined brighter than ever before, and it warmed me up to the point where I barely felt the freezing temperature of the water anymore. Means what, John? It means the world truly is gone. I kicked and tore at its flesh. Every now and then, a body, limb or viscera was pulled from the fleshscape and floated downstream towards the city. Those people were the brave ones, the ones that tried to leave but they had known the risk. They knew about the Guardians, yet they ventured across the border and now they were just pieces of meat floating with the river. That outside of this shit, people are living normal lives? Of course. The water wasn't very deep near the edge, but sudden surges in the current could easily sweep one of us away, especially a small, malnourished kid like James 3. When morning rolled around, John had left, either to keep us safe or because he had hollowed out and gone to face the storm 3 one last time. If he could get in, then maybe, just maybe, we could get out. He had learned to read from his father and he had written the journal as a reminder of what they had gone through in hopes that one day someone would save them. Though I was usually a light sleeper, I somehow barely came to, even as James 3 yelled. John had left his bed and seemingly vanished, leaving his journal neatly placed by my bedside. Wait, tell me the story first, he demanded. Let it be, I ordered. Even now, I can't tell how far I fell. Some of the empties were attempting to climb the wall, but its slippery surface caused them to slip and sink into the meat-filled mass. He didn't understand what I had just done. I turned back to James 3. I mumbled to myself. Can you tell me a story? That night as James 3 fell asleep, for the first time I told him a story about the future and not the past. A single empty person made it above the wall and wandered across the flesh. We rushed back towards the ruin that we had called home for the past day. James 3 barely acknowledged the horror before us, unafraid and apathetic to it. If he was just a brave kid or on the brink of turning empty, I couldn't tell. I'm proud of you. We were being lifted up towards it. James 3, what are you doing? They can't get us if we keep moving, he said. Is that what happened to your colony? He asked. Our colony was formed after the first 6 months we had gathered as many resources as we could, non-perishable foods and water. Since only 1,000 people survived the first 2 evacuations, we figured we would be fine for a few years at least. But the storm 3 kept pouring. I let him go, causing him to slip onto the muddy wet ground. I was born in 1995. And you have son in Portland. He had fallen unconscious from the cold and exhaustion. Once we had finally reached the house, I dropped the man on the driest part of the floor that I could find, and I started a futile attempt at making a fire while James 3 unpacked our things. Dad, I'm going to go look for food, James 3 stated, oddly confident. This would be his first time crossing the bridge without my help. On each prior cross, he had been too young and I had carried him on my back, or I had him way back at the colony. Without hesitating, I pulled her head back by her hair. A witness said that I had simply appeared in the middle of the field. So I'm writing this in their honor. It brought back memories of the second evacuation and the first empty people. I saw an image of myself holding onto my 3-year-old son with one arm and my wife with the other. Peter stomped dead in his tracks, halting our progress. What the hell do you mean 2020? The year, what else? I asked, confused. Peter got quiet. It held onto the ground with its legs, claws sticking out from all sides of the stumpy appendage. David McCurry. Rain. Thanks for watching. He simply climbed down from the wall, wielding his knife. I joked, stupidly trying to brighten up the mood. Shouldn't I be in a hospital? He asked again. These empties are different from the ones that we've seen in the city. According to my injuries, they believed that I had fallen quite a distance, but from where, they couldn't tell. I talked more about his mother until he fell asleep. As much as it pained me, I felt it important that he knew what a wonderful woman she was. A picnic. I peeked back at them and they seemed almost frozen, as if covered in ice emerging from the blue light. Mind me asking why you haven't left already? It wasn't a memory that I wanted to dig into. A few empty people wandered alongside us on our journey, too many to kill, and they seemed oblivious to our company. As we walked around on the riverside, the clicking got louder. Taking a piss was harder than one would have thought while soaking wet and freezing cold. Don't bother, we already looked through this place. As a stubborn kid, he reminded me of his mother, always adamant about finding solutions where there were none. Peter stepped in front of me. During the early days of the storm, we had all been a part of a mass evacuation. As the first buildings fell to sinkholes created by the downpour, people started to panic. We're better off focusing on the rough Storm 3. I patiently awaited by the shoreline 3 while James 3 went to relieve himself. The bridge was the name given to a collection of sinkholes spanning all around the city, 96 miles wide and 2 miles across, a place of destruction almost impossible to pass. A section of the sinkholes had been covered in various debris, cars and corpses, giving it the unfitting name, filling it to the brim to the point where we could cross, hence the bridge. What's that wall? I asked. Despite my malnourished body and wasted frame, I was far faster in the Storm 3 and I quickly pinned him down. "Let go of me, you're crazy!" he yelled. It was unlike anything that I had seen since the beginning of the storm, approaching as a blue sun lighting up everything around us. The light looked as cold as ice, yet it warmed us more than anything had for the past 7 years. "We're in Greenville," I said. Several tendrils extended from the ground, not trying to grab myself but going directly for James 3. A few clung on and I swung at them, severing a few on my second swing. One grabbed the shaft of my knife, cutting it into itself but causing me to let go of it. "Hang on, James 3. I yelled as I ran, my lungs almost bursting from the effort. The Guardians seemed bizarrely slow, quickly giving up on the chase as we got closer to the light. As usual, I found it hard to sleep, always worrying the house might collapse as so many buildings had. But James 3 slept blissfully, too young to comprehend the true dangers of the world. We had lost contact with the outside world, and anyone brave enough to venture into the dark zone ended up dead. Peter turned to run but I gave chase. I had stopped moving, lost in my own thoughts, unable to react with the outside world. He was falling back through the light towards the fleshscape. "John. Good luck to you both, John." Whatever pain it caused James 3, it was better than staying behind to be flayed by the monsters. One of the tendrils caught my leg, causing me to stumble to the ground and dropping James 3. After spending the whole night unconscious, he was finally coming back to it. "Water, water please," he said. I spit it out and lifted James 3 off the ground. "Holy shit, what the hell did you just do?" Peter yelled from the house. He stood frozen in fear, staring at my bloody hands. "How about a short summary then?" I sighed, already out of breath from the rough trek across the bridge, ignoring him initially, but he kept trying. He wasn't going to let it go. Before us, we saw an endless collection of sinkholes partially filled with solid debris. It changes people, it hollows them out, taking away their memories, stripping them of all emotion. It was so warm and so bright that we had to eat ice cream just to cool down. This is all just a bit bizarre. I stood up and paced around the room, 1,000 thoughts and ideas flowing through my mind. The rest would be spent crossing it. I stepped onto the riverbank, and the ground immediately twitched in reaction. She didn't even react as she quickly bled out. "Of course I'm not going to kill you. It's understandable that you're confused. Where'd you find these?" I asked, equally impressed and surprised. "Found them under some planks in the closet," he said, smiling. "We're not traversing the dark territory at night." "Hey, just a bit further, we're almost there," I said. Another grabbed him where he lay on the ground. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, nor feel at all anymore. It was as if the world had been erased and myself with it. If a better place is out there, I have to get my son to it. It was a man in his early 20s, thick long hair and well-fed. Keeping him warm and hydrated was all that he could do while he recovered. I decided to give him some space while I rested by the riverbank. "What do you mean, empty people?" I walked back over to the corpse of the thing that I had just killed, turning her over to see her face, full of scratches, even an eye missing, probably from walking into walls and debris lying around. "It's the Storm 3. I responded, baffled by the magnificent sight. A tall figure dug itself from the ground, towering 15 feet tall, 2 legs and a torso but without arms or a head. Its skin seemed charred black, vesicles covering the majority of its surface. 3 pulled themselves up through the flesh and gave chase after us. They were tall, much larger than before, but to our advantage, they were also slower. Every day for the past month. "We're almost there, James 3. Can you hang on for just a bit longer?" "I'll try. Be good and live a happier life in the sun." It emitted the clicking sound that we had heard, calling out for the tendrils which emerged from the ground in response. Yet it kept talking as if nothing had happened. Only a few hundred yards to safety. It had become clear how confused he really was. But don't let that fool you. He complied and we kept walking. It's been a bit hard to keep track, but I'm pretty sure we're either in July or August. James 3 nodded, shivering from the freezing water. My plan was simple enough in theory. Relieved, I let out a sigh. As a last resort, we attempted to flee on foot with the pitch-black clouds looming above us, striking down with lightning every so often, seeming to appear from the ground itself. My family and I were quite far in the back, and when reaching the border out of the city we halted in our steps. The ground shook as the muscles moved apart, leaving a large gash in the ground from where the guardians could emerge. I finally uttered after about the 10th time that he had asked. "Be good, kid." I remained awake, staring into the embers as the blizzard raged outside. Not like them. And in the center of it all, we have the sun. It's a bright yellow ball hanging up there, watching over us, keeping us warm. Only it never did, and after a month of the acidic storm 3 etching away at our once friendly city, buildings started collapsing, sinkholes swallowed the roads, and people died. I sat down on a rock, trying to catch my breath. He just stared at me. "The light, it hurts," he cried out as we got closer. Of course, the empty people looked around the bridge as well, but they were different. Those that existed there still had the basic instinct of escaping, making them far more terrifying than anything found within the city limits. He complied and we kept walking. "John, how about you tell me how all of this happened?" Peter asked. "Hey, don't get close. The river, despite its strong current, would be our safest option proceeding ahead. Alright, we better keep moving, but we can't walk on the land anymore."